Good morning, Ben.
Morning.
Nice to meet you.
Yeah, good to at least see you virtually.
Well, let's start. And frankly, I'm very eager to have this conversation with you, as of course, digitalization is a very important matter for the transformation of our company. And as we both know, the most difficult thing about leadership is to drive the change.
Let me just introduce this sequence by telling you that we see ourselves at the PSA group level as being Darwinian. We believe that the chaos is growing around the world, and the things we have to address for our business are becoming more and more chaotic. Hence the fact that we have to be Darwinian and adapt to this new world. And of course, for the leadership team, the challenge is to drive the change. Now, to drive the change, we have a certain number of great new tools coming in. One of them is digitalization, and we are constantly trying to figure out what is the best use of digitalization that we can do in the company to adapt in a Darwinian way to this changing and, if not, chaotic world. But I would like to have your insight on what kind of role do you see for digitalization in the big corporations like ours, and I will tell you how we are trying to use it from our side. Is that okay?
Yeah, because obviously it's a big topic, right? I mean, I think, like you know, all the new tools that are being developed, they're tools, right? By themselves, you know, if I introduce whether it's a new, you know, new sensors, new measurement tools, I introduce new communication tools. By themselves, they don't do anything, right? People need to use them. People need to use them, whether if you're going to use new metrics to try to understand what's going on internally, right? I think the challenge that at least we've always seen, so you know, in our work, what we do is collect a lot of data about what goes on within companies. And I guess the, you know, the challenge there is that a lot of times, you know, again, I could go to any company in the world. I could go to you and ask really basic questions about what goes on internally at PSA Group that you can't answer, right? Like, so how much, I don't know, does the executive team talk to R&D? You don't know, right? How many hours do people work, right? Now, those are basic questions, and they're critical questions, right? And the reason people can't answer them is that we don't have data, right? And now, to your point, we have the ability to start collecting that data, whether it's from, you know, little sensors like this, right, that literally can collect information on who's talking to who, how people talk to each other, where people are. We could talk about the creepy aspects of that as well. But all of that data and all of those analytics, and you know, at this point, we have by far the largest data set on workplace interaction in the world. By itself, I can show people pretty graphs. Where these new technologies become really powerful is when people use them to drive decisions, to drive cultural change. I think that one of the really big challenges is not that the technology isn't available today or that people can't start to use it. It's that these technologies, or using this kind of data, it's not the way that companies have been managed, right? If you're going to do a reorg, you know, how do people do reorgs today? Somebody reads an article in Harvard Business Review about what Google does, right? We say Google's cool, let's do the same thing as them. That's crazy. That makes no sense. I can only imagine when you run a marketing campaign or you're trying to improve operations, you're going to collect a lot of data, you're going to run tests. But when it comes to how we actually manage our businesses, we don't do that, right? We read some articles, we hire some consultants and pay them a lot of money to give us a very nice PowerPoint deck. But that's not the future. That's not. That is really, really slow, right? And the advantage of all these tools, whether it's you know, the ability to collaborate, you know, virtually really effectively, whether it's the ability to collect really unprecedented amounts of data or to predict things or automate things that couldn't be done before, the really valuable stuff is still done by people. And the power of these technologies are to recombine those people in different ways. And I think that really the challenge is that a lot of companies, they might say, okay, well, I'm willing to buy a technology, I'm willing to write a check for it. The bigger challenge is to culturally change, and that's really hard and takes a lot of time. And I think that, you know, to the Darwinian side, you're going to see some companies that don't do that, and they frankly just won't exist in 10, 15 years. And it's been interesting for us because, so I run a startup that came out of my research, that I did for my PhD. And we have more than enough companies coming to us who are want us to roll out our technology, and that's fine. But when we have companies that come to us and they don't have, some near-term goal that they want to accomplish, the person who is going to be looking at our analytics doesn't have decision-making authority. We could talk about all these different things. Long story short, we just don't work with those people because we know that they're not going to exist in the long term. And I think that cultural change, it takes obviously folks like yourself to drive that from the top, but it requires constant effort and recognition that just installing a tool doesn't solve the problem. And we're not done. That's just the beginning. So I don't know if that actually answered your question at all, but that's broad thoughts on the topic.
Well, I think you are absolutely on the spot. And by the way, it totally connects with the things we are trying to do. And what I am feeling listening to you is that it's very consistent on the what. But in fact, for companies like ours, the most difficult thing is the how, not always the what. On the what side of this kind of trend, we are trying to do three things. One is to make sure that we are using the talent of our people in a more deep and meaningful way, which for us means making sure that people work in a more relaxed and creative conditions than what has been the case so far, which means work-life balance, which means making sure that people can work from wherever they want to be working from. They don't have always to go to the office and face the traffic jams or the strikes on the public transportation or things like that, which means giving them a working environment that gives them more flexibility to work in conditions where their creativity and their full potential can be unleashed. So that's one direction where digitalization may help us, and actually we are encouraging our people not to come to the office and work from either their home or anywhere else. But of course, at the end of this process, there is, of course, the need for the team to gather from time to time and have the social relationship that helps to have a great team spirit and good personal connections with the other team members. That's one direction. Another direction is that actually, as a car company, we are very, very far away from the real customers. And digitalization is giving us the opportunity to get closer, if not in contact, with the real final customer, being in the way they use our services, the way they use our cars, the way they shop, the way they select the appropriate specs. All of this is something that, surprisingly, we don't know so well, surprisingly. But it's the reality, and the reality is that digitalization is giving us the capability to get closer to the final customer and understand much better what they are doing with our services and with our products. In some cases, new technologies are popping in, and we don't even figure out how they are being used because it's the technology that has the edgy position and not the expression of the need that is coming first. That's the second area. And the third area, of course, is lead time, speed, and the way we create the products and the services within the company where we can save a lot of money and a lot of time by being totally digitalized all over the value creation process from upstream down to the showroom at the end of the day. So those are three directions on which, for us, digitalization makes total sense. But you see, you made the point, and this is very, very true, is it's not all about the data, it's the way you combine the data, the way you use the data to figure out how you can make your customers happier, how you can make your organizations more effective. And of course, this is not about organizational charts, it's about creating the workflow, the digitalized workflow, and then adapting the organizations to this kind of efficiency and effectiveness that digitalization is bringing to you. I don't know if that makes sense for you.
No, that makes sense. I mean, I think that the question that I would throw back to you is, you have all these changes that you're making to how you want the company to operate. is that like, how do you know that that's happening?
Well, let's be frank.
And again, yeah.
I don't know.
Sorry, go ahead.
I don't know if it's that if
right.
it's happening. The only thing I can do is drillings and deep dives and visits to the front line, and that's what I'm trying to do. But of course, it's a very, very limited number of things I'm seeing compared to
you have 400,000 people, right?
Yeah, sure. It's absolutely limited. So the frank answer is we don't know.
Yeah. Well, and that's, again, and obviously I'm coming at this from a biased perspective because this is what I did from a PhD research and what we do. But again, I would still argue that you're now installing all of these tools that part of what they do is essentially collect data on this stuff, right? I think that a lot of what I see a lot of companies that start to make these big strategies but they don't operationalize what their goals are. So you say, I want to people work from home. Okay, well let's make that concrete. How many days a week do you want people to work from home? Okay, I want it 1 day a week. I want it 2 days a week. Or we can just admit that I don't know. I don't know.
No, we have specific rules for that.
1 day. Okay, so great. So, and then there's beyond that. There's, okay, well, if people work from home, I want to make sure they're still working with their team, communicating with their team. Is that happening, right? There's all those things like that where, and again, I'm sure for some of these you have metrics and for some you don't. But I guess what I would say is that, and it's not to say that things like site visits aren't effective. They absolutely are. There are a lot of qualitative things that you get from that observation that the kind of data that can be collected won't tell you, right? But I think it's that combination. It's that, the fact that this digitalization gives you a macro level view of what goes on within the organization, or as you said, with your customers and all these things. And that combining that with the qualitative insights, again, that's where it gets really powerful. But again, typically we start and stop at the qualitative stuff. And I think that as we have more of these tools, there's less and less of an excuse to not pull in all of that data to help see, we have this strategy to make people work in this way, to use these tools in this way. Is this happening? Is it not? And if it's not, is it not happening because actually we were wrong? Because we could be wrong, right? We could say, I want everybody to work from home, but actually, you know what? That's not working. And that's okay. Like, I think from my perspective, one of the best parts of these new technologies is that we can admit that we don't really know what we're doing. We have hypotheses, but we can test them. The challenge has been that if, again, we were going to implement a new work from home policy in the past, or I was going to build a new headquarters, right? It was something where I couldn't measure, faster than on a yearly basis. So I can't reasonably, test different, whether it's programs, whether it's office designs, but we can because now we have data coming in on a daily basis. And I think that it's that same transition that, like to your point, it seems like you're starting to do that with the customer side now. But I guess what I'd say is whatever is going on there, I would hope that the same thing starts to happen, in the people side of the organization.
Absolutely, and you see, your point is so valid that we came up with some very what I call exciting ideas, and for some people eventually disturbing ideas. If we want to make sure that we can make a good value creation flow using digitalized tools and new ways of working as a team, we could state, for instance, that in a couple of years we want to collapse the head office of the company. We don't want any more head office for our PSA group. We say, well, there is no more head office, right? So there is no more head office. You don't have technocracy, bureaucracy, lengthy debates about things which are not so important. Let's just work on solving the problems, on making sure that we get a result to be the best on the marketplace, that we can measure the improvement of customer satisfaction in this service or this product or whatever. Let's start from there. So the goal is to improve the performance, whatever kind of performance we have, and we don't have anymore the possibility to gather people in a real estate asset that we are just going to collapse. So we say there is no more head office for PSA. So how do we use the tools in a way where people feel good from a human perspective to work together most of the time with the digital tools, and from time to time they gather in a specific premise to discuss and have a direct contact and a good team opportunity for sharing the major difficulties and challenges. That may be a way to challenge the system and to push the system to do something which is radically different. If not, we are taking the risk of being on a Kaizen mode, which is we are just adjusting by small adaptations, but not looking for the breakthroughs. Do you have any examples of other companies that have tried to have this kind of disruptive approach on using the digital tools?
Yeah, well, I think that the best examples that I've seen are not necessarily at first where companies did it across the entire organization, but rather they rolled it out in a certain division and saw, do we feel like it accomplished what we wanted here? If yes, that's great, and if it didn't, then you do it somewhere else. So at one of, trying to think of the best example, but at one of our customers, they had, so they had one of their divisions which had, the divisional headquarters had like 5,000 people, and they moved them from, again, this old campus. It was probably per square meter the worst office I've ever been in, so it's not a nice place to work. But what they did is they moved part of those people. Well, they moved everybody essentially to main campus with all the other divisional groups, so they weren't just isolated. But at the same time, and this maybe gets a little bit to what you're saying, they cut the number of desks in half. And again, they moved everybody onto chat tools, and they had a number of other systems they installed. Now, what was really interesting but it was a test. So this company has hundreds of thousands of knowledge workers globally. This was the first group that they did this with, and they wanted to see, well, quantitatively, how did that change how people work? And what they wanted was, they wanted this group to work very cohesively internally, so they wanted lots of internal communication. They wanted a little bit more communication between departments, right? But just a little bit. That wasn't a huge issue. And what they saw was when they moved them to this campus and then people could work remotely, the communication with other departments increased dramatically. But what actually happened on the flip side was communication within this department went down significantly, way too much. And what was interesting was they saw that the likelihood that people would communicate, even over chat or Skype or whatever, was directly proportional to how far away our seats were. So even though we weren't even in the office all the time, it was rare, maybe 2-3 times a week, the fact that I would occasionally bump into you and I'd say, oh yeah, I forgot, I got to get back to Carlos about that thing, right? That the tools that they had at least, right, that was lost. That was not easy for them to replicate. Again, it's not to say that's not possible, right? With one of our other customers, it's a big software development company, they had an incredibly strong culture of essentially just randomly calling people up on Skype during the day just to chat. And it took a lot of work, but they have thousands of remote software developers. And what they were able to show was essentially these, they could make people higher performing by connecting them with more socially diverse groups externally. The point though, again, I think the point is that the baseline cultures were different. And just by changing physical space, installing new tools by themselves without a lot of work to change the culture, it's not necessarily going to be successful, right? And I think a lot of what I see in companies that start to roll out these kind of tools is they assume because some company they admire are doing it, that's going to solve all their problems. And they don't realize these are still just management tools. And that the hard work of cultural change, right, I don't feel like that is dramatically sped up. Right? I feel that, and I'd be interested in your thoughts on this, but I don't feel like we're that much better at changing cultures more quickly. I think we're better at other things, and we can do those more quickly. But I don't feel like these tools have dramatically sped up that part of the process, and so companies can't forget that.
Well, it's a great point. You see, I think that human beings need to be managed in a way where they feel that they have a meaningful relationship with each other so that they can unleash their full potential. And that's why the balance between a digital workflow and a workflow based on the presence of team members around the same table in the same meeting room needs to be found. This balance for me is something which is not a given. It depends on the kind of activities you have, kind of problems you want to solve. All of this, as you said, it's a tool. It's not a goal by itself. Digitalization is a tool, it's not a goal, which means that we use digitalization to find a better balance between being fast and efficient and with a very short lead time from one side, and on the other side, being innovative, creative, and putting people in a framework where they can express the best potential. So this balance for me is something that I think it's hard to decide. You have to test and adapt depending on the functions, depending on the activities, depending on the background culture of the company. And at the same time, I think it's also important to recognize that digitalization needs to be used in a way where people understand that it's all about performance. And this is something that at the PSA Group we are very, very sensitive on, because we were almost bankrupt 5 years ago. And we spent a lot of time reminding ourselves that it was very stressful to be almost bankrupt 5 years ago. So now we understand how important it is to be breathing performance every day. And then the question becomes, if the only thing that protects the company and the people is performance, then how can we use those digital tools to improve the performance? And for us, performance is not vague. It's customer satisfaction, it's cost, it's pricing power, it's about making sure that we have a high level of profitability, as long as we don't have a better measurement of efficiency and effectiveness. So we are in this world. And again, for the time being, what I have found is that the most efficient way to move digitalization is not to make any rule. But you see, coming back to the work at home versus the work at the office, it's also obvious that if you plan for a head office that has only the capacity of 50% of your headcount, you need to make sure that you combine the satisfaction of working in a workflow which is both physical and digital, and everybody feels good about it and everybody is expressing his best potential from one side. But on the other side, you are also taking the best leverage of this by optimizing your assets and by having a much smaller headquarters with lower operational costs and lower investments that you can use to develop more technology, for instance. So all of this has to be holistic, has to be a 360-degree approach, which of course makes it very exciting.
Well, but I think that's the question, right? Because what you care about, I would argue, right? Cost matters, to your point. If you go bankrupt, that's not good. But there's this question of, okay, you moved into a new headquarters recently, right? Mm-hmm. In the last year or so?
Yes.
Right. So the whole question, what I would argue, right? The whole question is not, could I save $50 million on the headquarters? Right. Question is, how can I maximize that investment so I improve performance? Because if I spend an extra $50 million, but I improve the performance of the entire company by 3%, 5%, you tell me what makes sense, I'm spending that every single time.
Sure.
I think the challenge has been this disconnect between management decisions and these outcomes. And I'm interested because you're talking about these hard performance metrics. And I can see how at the company level those hold. But I'm wondering, are you using any of these tools internally to more granularly say, I'm curious, for like the executive team, I'm sure you could say, well, your performance is maybe the P&L of your unit, right? But now let's go to R&D. What's their performance? Right? That's really hard to define, right? And so I'm curious, are you looking at these different decisions that you're making through that lens of ROI versus cost? And it's not accusation. It's more that a lot of times I see, for obvious reasons, but I see lots of companies, they look at people as a cost. I look at tools as a cost, right? Now you're saying I need to invest in these new tools because I believe that's going to improve performance, right? But as we go along, there needs to be proof points there, but again, we need to be able to measure those things. So I'm just sort of curious how you approach those things.
You see, one of the things which is exciting is that for people like me who went through different experiences in terms of managing companies or even turning around companies that were near bankruptcy, we used to say that a cost is a certainty and a revenue is an hypothesis, which means revenue eventually will happen, but cost will surely happen, which then means that we would be missing, from your fair point, a lot of efficiency opportunities coming from digitalization, because we would see the cost of using those tools before we can measure the revenue. And that's where data can be very important, because with a wise and thoughtful use of the available data, you can have a better grasp of the revenue improvement that you are going to generate through the investment of the appropriate digitalized tools. And that's where I see a big benefit. It's look at the transaction cost in the sales and marketing business. If you understand that you are making features for a car that people are never selecting in your digitalized tools when they make up the specs for the final order of the car, if you see that they are not even considering a certain level of specs, it means that those specs have no value. So why the hell did we develop those specs if people are never selecting those specs in the configurator of the car that you have in your showrooms? So in that case, it's quite obvious that the good investment of the digitalized tool called the configurator, where you see the customer journey, selecting different menus, and the way you are building the car you want to order, you can of course easily appreciate what is the saving that is going to be facing the cost of this digitalized tool. And that may be very helpful to put on the same level both the revenue expectation and the cost certainty that you have through this tool. And that's a very fair point that eventually may be a big change. But again, it's on the how, not on the what. So then the topic would be, how do you evaluate, using the data, the fact that some of the features you are developing are not attractive for the customer, not only because he doesn't select them very often, but also because he never considers that in the way he is building the final spec of the car on the configurator, as an example.
Yeah. Well, and that seems to me like really the ideal way to use these new tools. And as we talk about whether it's predictive technologies and AI or machine learning techniques, the power of them is that you can figure out, okay, no one's picking this tool, right? Or that this feature. Or here's a new feature that I'm going to, that looks very similar to this other feature, and I can predict that it's likely to have this kind of a selection rate, right? And maybe it's wrong, but you can at least get those predictions. But that the idea that what people are doing, right, that those predictions free people up from having to do that, because we're not great at it, and they enable people to think, here's some totally new thing we could make. Completely new thing, which these kind of algorithms are terrible at. They're terrible at coming up with these new ideas. But we ask, again, we typically ask people to be essentially these robots when it comes to trying to tabulate this data or analyze these things. And rather than doing that, it seems like what you're talking about is using these tools for that purpose, which they're good at, and freeing up people to do other things. I mean, I guess of course the question always comes up, does that mean that everyone's going to lose their jobs? Or which I'm sort of curious what you think, because I'm very much not of that opinion. But I do think it means that what people do is going to be increasingly what people are good at, and not so much what maybe we've asked them to do in the past.
Sure, and I think your example is pretty clear. Let's take the feature example. Instead of having people engineering features that customers will not buy, it is better that we have people using their brains to make judgments on analyzing the customer journey in the way they are selecting the features for their final order, which of course it needs a lot more judgment and obviously more skills in the way they appreciate the way the customer is making decisions. So I don't think that we are going to lose jobs. We are going to replace low added value jobs by higher added value jobs. That's what is going to happen. And the higher added value jobs are in the way we are assembling the data and taking conclusions out of this data assembly, data engineering process that we could have in the company. And again, for me, the important way is how do I create a framework where people in my organization feel free to give up the old systems and the old rules where they see, well, level 1, I need to have this feature, level 2, I need to have this feature, level 3, I need to have this feature, and they give up this stuff and they start thinking about let's make a clinic test where I'm going to observe what the customer is reacting to in the way he is being exposed to new features and possible combinations on this car. But I cannot just decide from the last floor of my office that people would move from the ticking the box kind of approach on the features to a more high judgment approach where you analyze the data coming from different clinic tests to see how people are reacting to different features. So this is important. And the question I have for you is, do you think that younger generations and millennials would more spontaneously or more naturally go in the direction of making judgments on the customer journeys than just respecting the processes? Because from time to time, even for millennials, we may have a doubt.
Yeah. Well, so I'm not big on the generational things. Actually, one thing we're doing right now is using our data from, millions and millions of people to look at, do millennials actually work differently than everybody else? And it looks like it's mostly mitigated on role. But to your point, let's just step back. People who are younger have had different experiences, both with technology and then, in the world, than people who are older, right? There's an increasing push in organizations as well as just society more generally to get really create more agency and decision making in the frontline people. Exactly what you were just talking about, right? You don't want to be sitting in your office and saying, "Here's how everything's going to go." You want to push that to people at the front of the line. And I do think that the way that a lot of new technologies work really does accentuate that. I think that as with so I think that's something to take advantage of, right? I think that is something where people are increasingly comfortable with it, and as people tend to be, the younger someone tends to be, the more they tend to be comfortable with that. I think that, again, as with everything, the challenge is really merging those abilities and people who tend to be really good at that with people who have deep subject matter expertise and enable them to work together effectively, right? I think that this is not a new problem, first of all. I will say the exact characteristics of people today and what the society we've grown up in is different than it has been in the past, but constantly, and this is not going to end, right? To your point, once millennials are in their 60s, there's going to be other folks that are used to the world working in a different way, and that's going to have to constantly develop. And this gets to the whole Darwinian process you brought up at the beginning, right? That ensuring that people, whether it's from age, whether it's from different backgrounds, are able to work together effectively and using that diversity to do better work. There's tons of data that's the case. Doing that effectively is so important, right? And that relies on getting a mix of I think the challenge has been that most organizations have been very poor at incorporating people with these different backgrounds in different parts of the company. It's mostly been, right, again, I work at a company for 30 years, that's the only way I move up. Well, and if it's only been, and if 30 years ago, it's only a bunch of, white guys in the company, that's all that's going to be, and it's going to be everyone who's 60 years old or whatever, which in the past, maybe you could defend that, but there's not a good reason for it to be that way. And I think that making use of these, new leaders who are coming up really is just forces us to question why things are today. And that if the answer is, well, that's how we've always done it, that's never a good reason to do something in a certain way. You know, you could keep doing things in a certain way, but you should at least know, here's why we're doing it. And I think that when it comes to, you know, getting people who are good at frontline decision making, being able to identify those people, right? I don't think it's just age. I think there's a lot of things that fall into that. But being able to identify them, being able to empower them, and ensuring that we are then spreading that throughout the organization. Like, that's, companies who do that well are going to succeed, right? And ones that don't just won't exist.
And that's a great argument for promoting diversity in the companies. See, we had an experience recently which I found extremely important. You know, in a car company, by experience, you only have 7 or 8 business processes. It's not more complicated than that. You can describe 6, 7, max 8 business processes that you need to master to run a car company. And when I talk to young managers, which I do every month, I have a dozen of young managers with whom I discuss every month, and I ask them, what is the most frustrating experience that you are faced with in our company? Most of the time, what they tell me is, Mr. President, it's having 3 meetings with 25 people in the room and making no decisions. They are not talking to me about the working conditions. They are not talking to me about the salaries. They are not talking to me about the nice offices. They are talking to me about, we gather 25 people in the room and we don't make decisions. This is very frustrating. And then that's, for me, is very impactful. And I told my team, I said, look, guys, we have 7 or 8 major business processes. Why don't we re-engineer those processes to make them more fluid, more dynamic, less resource consuming, less technocracy, bureaucracy, faster processes. Let's get the job done. And then we set a certain number of groups, working groups, trying to be creating them as diverse as we could. And last time we had a very nice experience about development of products. And we had an absolutely gorgeous presentation about the development processes. The presentation was perfect. The development description was perfect. We could tick all the boxes of what we should do to have a perfect product at the end of the day. But it was the description of what we should exactly do now. It was not a disruptive new process where we would reduce by 50% the number of milestones. We would increase by 30% the speed at which we create the value and reduce the lead time. It was very funny to see that even with a diverse team, I couldn't come up with a proposal that completely disrupts the development process. It was the description of what we know how to do today and a combination of what should be done in a very rigorous and professional way for the thing to work. Yes, but that's what we should be doing now. So what is the new process?
That's right.
And I suppose that the answer to this result, which is not what we were looking for, I think the answer is what you said. It's all about creating the conditions for a very highly diverse team from all different axes, being age, professional background, citizenship, gender, whatever you name it, highly diverse, to make sure that they come up with the disruptive ideas and they propose to you a development process which is faster, less resource consuming, and more rewarding because less bureaucratic.
But I think also the idea that, you know, you have a really large company, right? Probably some of those teams already exist in some areas, right? And I think the advantage is sort of being able to use that diversity, because some people, again, here's your ideal process, right? And there's this question of, well, how many times does that happen, right? And when it happens, is that good? Because we think it's good. But, you know, maybe these teams are supposed to work with each other, but actually, in this case, someone shortcuts that whole process, right? Now, that could be bad, right? Maybe they do that and then we miss all these milestones. Maybe they do that and we actually go a lot faster, right? And I think that, you know, part of that, some of that is on, you know, incremental improvements, right? But I think the idea to at least see, you know, for people who are doing this today, what actually works, and then when you know, to empower people to try out something new, I think, and you know, the challenge there is that they very well could get it wrong. And so when they try it, and you say, because you know, even if someone has a very nice presentation, And you can say, this looks completely transformational, but it might not work. You don't know if it's going to work beforehand. And so empowering people to say, if you're wrong, I'm not going to fire you, right? We agree that this is a good thing to try, right? And I think it's the combination of those things is really important. That empowering those people to fail is critical. Yeah.
That's a great point. You know, empowerment to fail is something that we don't use so often in our industry, but I think it makes total sense. So at the end of the day, Ben, what do you think from a leadership standpoint we should be doing to prepare for this future way of improving the way we do things? Let me give you just one example. Yeah. I'm constantly reminded or requested to make rules. People ask me, this is not working well, why don't you make a rule for this and a rule for that? And I systematically say no. I don't want to make rules, I want to destroy rules. I think in our Western society we have too many rules, too many regulations. This is crashing the breathing space and the creativity of human beings. We want to show you the spirit in which I want to do business beyond, of course, the compliance. Beyond that, what is the spirit with which we would like to do our business, which is make our customers happy, make them recognize the value of what we create, and make it a sustainable business to be able to invest in the future and bring this human satisfaction to other generations of people in the company. So how do we adapt our leadership to this very changing world where I think we need less rules than the reverse? I think we need to give more breathing space. I think we need more diversity. I think we need to be outspoken in the way you just mentioned, which is ability to fail, it's okay. You can fail because if you don't fail from time to time, then collectively we cannot win. So it is okay to fail. How should we adapt in terms of leadership to these new conditions from your perspective?
Well, and I think you have to move to experimentation, right? I mean, I can even talk about what we do internally. So, admittedly, my company is not nearly as big as yours, right, at this point. But maybe we'll be one day. But one thing we do is just openly admit we're going to try something out. We're going to try things out, and if they don't, we're doing it because it is our best guess about what to do today, right? But we might be wrong, and if we're wrong, we're going to try something else, right? And that's okay. Now there are some rules you have to have, but at the same time, even with how we do budgets, right? So, just as one example, I've seen this, and this probably happens internally for you. I've seen tons of companies where you get to the end of a quarter and people are spending money because if I don't spend my money, then my budget gets cut, right? Which makes no sense at all, right? And so what I've done at the beginning of the year is I said, here's a percentage budget allocation for each department. That's what it's going to be, okay? And as we book additional revenue beyond our targets, then that money will be dispersed to each department according to those percentages. Within your budget, you can do whatever you want. If you want to save that money to hire more people, knock yourself out. If you want to buy tools, knock yourself out, right? But I trust those people, right? I trust them. And if I see someone at some point is way under budget, then we'll have a conversation about, why are you saving this money for something? But I'm not going to take it away from them, right? And I think that, again, it's one example, but I think this idea of building up to a point where, or with our training program, we could talk about a bunch of examples. But I think as I've seen bigger companies try to get to a point where we can test at the same time 5 different training programs, 6 different ways of working from home, right? The way to do that, you can't just jump there at the beginning. You have to start with, we're going to do one thing, right? So first, you probably already have some change that you've got planned, right? Let's say you're doing a reorg. Okay, I'm not even going to modify it. I'm just going to try to see quantitatively what the impact of that is. I'm going to measure it. Then I can prove to people internally, well, here are things we can actually measure. Now let's actually use these analytics, these metrics to plan an intervention. Now let's test multiple things at a time, but all these things are tests. We're going to test a couple things at a time, right? And then you can build up to a point where, one of our customers, which is a Fortune 100 company, they're now running. They went from about 4 years ago doing that sort of before and after just measurement, really simple, to now they're doing over 60 different tests internally to testing whether it's new IT tools, whether it's new processes, workplace tool, I mean, you name it, right? But that takes time. But I think building up from the top, right? Saying I am going to do this and I'm going to experiment, and you being wrong, right? And you being public about that, being okay, that it requires that kind of leadership to move, especially a large organization. And this is, I'm sure, not a newsflash, but I think the moving towards experimentation and leading, especially at first, like you leading or leadership taking ownership of that is so important, because if you don't do it, right, well then, if you tell somebody to do it, well, they're like, well, but you're not doing that, so I really can't. And I think that, as we all know, unfortunately, there's not like a shortcut to that, but that with these new technologies, the advantage is that we can do that a lot more quickly, right, in terms of being able to fail or succeed on those experiments, right, and that move that to be the standard way that every part of the business operates.
Well, that's really a great conclusion, Ben. I deeply appreciate that. I want to keep in mind the fact that new leadership leading by experimentation that is somewhere supported by data and the way we use data to make good judgments on how did we succeed or how did we fail in the experimentation is really a leadership mode that could give more flexibility to the minds and of course unleash more potential of our people. I think that's a great point, and to be frank with you, at the PSA Group, I don't think we are doing that enough in terms of stating that we are going to do this kind of experiment with this kind of data and this kind of judgment based on the way we are going to engineer the data through the process. I think that's a great point, and it helps us a lot to adapt to this new world, because it is our strong intention to be Darwinian, make sure that we don't become dinosaurs, and that we want to keep on selling freedom of movement to our customers and make sure that they experience the best, the safest and the most comfortable and affordable freedom of movement from the PSA products. Thank you, Ben. It was a great experience to discuss with you. I hope we'll have the opportunity to discuss again, and see you very soon.
Yeah, great. Yeah, see you soon.
Bye-bye.
So yeah, I'll be in town in late January, so we could see if schedules align. But
absolutely.
Yeah, again, I really enjoyed the discussion. I'm glad we found some time. Awesome.
Thank you.
Okay.
Great discussion.
Right, take
see
care.
You, Ben. Thank you.
Good
Bye-bye.
evening.